So one of the questions I get asked a lot, as a Catholic, as a Thomist, and really as someone who's just a strong advocate for traditional morality, traditional ethics, the natural family, um, is how do I justify that rationally? How do I justify my natural law tradition on rational grounds? What are the arguments in its favor? And I kind of want to devote this video entirely to that, specifically within the realm of sexual ethics, which is really exclusively what they have in mind when they ask that question, predictably. And I think it's quite pertinent that that the rational defense for traditional ethics really gets out there in the public, because it really seems to me that as all this degeneracy is being put forward through our institutions, government, the public school system, media, and that lack of philosophical and rational justification for traditional ethics has served as a vacuum that these pernicious forces can then fill in and act as though they are the only respectable intellectual position to have on these matters. I mean, it's gotten to the point where you can literally not hold the opinions that your grandparents held without being ostracized as some bigot and hateful right-wing extremist. And I think part of the reason for that is because we don't actually have very many sophisticated philosophical arguments to put forward in the conversation. And so they just see moral and social conservatism as just some brute outward expression of inner instinctive disgust that arises from bigotry. And I think this is very regrettable, because really both sides of the aisle only constitute a fraction of the range of philosophical approaches to this issue. And in my estimation, the most powerful moral argument against sexual degeneracy, and within that category, I'm including, I think, the following categories of sexual behavior. That would be homosexuality, certainly, contraception, pornography, just these kinds of acts. I mean, a popular slogan on this channel, of course, is, fat is degeneracy, and we all agree with that. But why do we agree with that? And that's the question that I'm going to try to explore with some arguments from my own natural law tradition in moral philosophy, which stands as the official means of theologizing and philosophizing moral matters in the Catholic Church. Its usefulness, though, is not limited to the confines of the Church, and as will be shown, I think we can deduce from natural reason alone its usefulness and rational unavoidability, particularly as applicable to these moral issues that I just mentioned. Before we can construct an argument for natural law against any specific act, though, a sufficient understanding of natural law, as well as a philosophical justification for it as the correct system of ethics by which human acts are judged to be licit or illicit, I think is in order. So first, what do I mean by natural law? This basic question is more pivotal to this topic than may be immediately apparent, for in many cases, advocates for these modes of sexual behavior that a lot of people advocate for, they dismiss arguments against their cause from natural law based on a misunderstanding of what natural law actually is. So to understand this, it may be helpful to clarify what's meant by the words nature and law in the context of natural law, for a great many objections I think are predicated upon a misunderstanding of one or the other. So nature in this theoretical framework does not refer to that which is produced by artifice, right? By artifacts such as, a toothbrush or a house, maybe a computer, nor does it refer to that which is of itself relating to the outdoors. Instead, nature refers to really essence, as in, the nature of a plant. In other words, it refers fundamentally to that which makes a thing the kind of thing that it is, as opposed to some other thing. It is the nature of a triangle, for example, that it be a three-sided polygon. Now, definitionally speaking, and I'm taking this from Aristotle, nature is defined accordingly. The nature of a thing, then, is a certain principle and cause of change and stability in a thing, and it is directly present in it, which is to say that it is present in its own right and not coincidentally. And I'm taking that from the Physics, Book 2, Part 1. So, in other words, nature refers to the inner substance of what a thing fundamentally is, which remains changeless in the face of change, whence springs its various ends, inclinations, powers, and movements belonging properly to the thing in question. It refers to, simply speaking, the essence or substance of the thing in question. Now, as to law, per St. Thomas Aquinas, he says the following: a law is a rule and measure of acts, whereby man is induced to act or is restrained from acting. For lex is derived from legare, precisely because it binds one to act. So St. Thomas goes on to explain that the only rule and measure of human acts must be reason, since it is reason that directs the ends and movements of all human acts that can be properly so called. And it is the rule and measure of human acts that pertains to natural law. Therefore, given these two clarifications of nature and law, it would stand to reason that, taken together, natural law would pertain to the rule and measure of human acts through the mode of a particular rational creature, i.e., a human being. Natural law, however, cannot be said to exist in a vacuum, since it is inherently derivative, and one cannot begin to understand natural law without reference to that from which natural law is derived. This would be what St. Thomas would refer to as the eternal law. Now, the eternal law is a term synonymous with the divine logos, or the divine reason, who fashions the natures of all things and directs them towards their ends that flow from their essences as conceived in the divine mind. Natural law, then, principally, can be said to consist in man's cooperation with the eternal law, whereby he partakes in the providence of God, insofar as he respects his God-given nature by living in conformity with what his reason discerns his nature to be in its pure form, abstracted by his intellect, and therefore reflective of how God conceived it. That which is in right conformity to the authentic being of his nature is the good, and that which deviates from the authentic being of his nature is evil, as evil is none other than a privation or a lack of being, really. This is a fundamental precept of the natural law upon which the specific precepts are based. Good is to be sought after and evil avoided. This is the first precept because goodness is convertible with being on this view, and being is the first and most preeminent of realities apprehended by the intellect. So likewise, goodness is the first and preeminent sought after by the will, which proceeds from the intellect. Since the good is none other than being as sought after by the will, it is properly understood as an end, a term which refers to the teleological inclinations that tend beyond a substance towards some good that fulfills some appetite or inclination. The first specific precept of the natural law, though, is understood through the lens of teleology and is the self-perpetuation of one's existence. This is numerically listed first, as it is the most basic and causally conditions the others, since one's existence precedes one's manner of existence. Thus, whatsoever concerns the preservation of one's life, whether it be the positive pursuit of goods or the prevention of evils, is of the natural law. The second precept, which is common to all animals, is the procreative faculty that tends toward the generation and bearing and rearing of children. Now, this precept is, of course, going to be of essential focus to this video, since the sexual behaviors I mentioned, homosexuality, contraception, what have you, these are going to be argued to be deviations from the good that ought to be sought after from this precept. And the third precept chiefly concerns man's reason, the highest good sought after being God himself, as he is the substance of truth itself, which is that towards which reason is inclined. Indeed, this ultimate end of the third precept constitutes the highest good attainable by man, which is the vision of the absolute unconditioned truth itself, which is God's essence. This is a natural desire of sorts, but many medieval scholastics debate the extent to which this obediential potency that they call it is called neither natural or supernatural, but that's kind of neither here nor there. Now, One may object by inquiring why exactly one ought to identify the good with the inclination to man's teleology. Now, this objection ultimately cuts to the heart of whether the entire basis upon which natural law is built stands to rational scrutiny, so I think it's important to address. This objection really has its spiritual roots in Humean philosophy, in my judgment, which argues that it is rationally untenable to insist upon a moral ought as derivative of an ontological is. In other words, just because something is the way it is does not necessarily entail any moral obligations associated therewith. This objection, however, fails to fully understand what is precisely meant by the good. The word good has been, in my view, debased in its connotation and fails to get at the heart of what the natural law theorist really means by the term. The good, according to the natural law theorist, is none other than being as sought after by the will. It is in fact convertible with being, according to St. Thomas, for if it were not, where do you get goodness from? It seems to me that when we speak of goodness, we inevitably imply that something has been perfected in some way. And if you take a look at perfection conceptually and you analyze it logically, it would seem to me that you come to the logically inevitable conclusion that you can't understand perfection itself without reference to being. Because if something is perfected, as for example, a triangle is perfected to the degree that it conforms to its geometrical definitions, or a heart is perfected to the degree to which it functions properly as a heart, these perfections flow from the nature of what it is to be a specific thing that is called good. And that is determined by being. That's determined by the actuality of a thing according to its nature. It's the thing's conformity to essentially what it is. And this is to agree with the actuality of a thing, the being of a thing. And so you can't understand perfection apart from being. So much less can we understand goodness apart from being. Furthermore, just as a kind of side argument, if goodness is not ultimately derived from being, then goodness would really, I think, be reduced to some singular entity among other entities. Its very existence and manner thereof would be shrouded in ambiguity and dubiousness. Why even propose its existence? Where can it be found? How does it exist? What evidence is there to show that it does exist? There is simply no evidence whatsoever for the existence of any entity called goodness that is not simply synonymous or directly derivative of being that is sought after by the will. It simply doesn't exist, especially because any entity existing outside of being is simply constitutive of non-being. And unless proponents of this objection are trying to imply that there exists some individual entity called goodness subject to spatio-temporal relations, then I think the Thomistic notion of goodness should suffice. So now that natural law has been sufficiently explained and defined as to its essence, one can use the principles derived from what has been said in order to engage in the ruling and measuring of particular human acts, such as, per the thesis of this video, homosexual acts, contraception, and the like. Now, these, I think, don't really need to be defined, but to kind of illustrate that which connects them all together, I'll use homosexual acts as just an example. These can, be defined as any activity between two persons of the same sex that is sexual in nature, that is, of or pertaining to the organs of generation and the associative pleasures derived therefrom, directly or indirectly. And so that, of course, is in common with contraception inasmuch as the organs pertaining to the generation of offspring, and we all know what those are, they are used in a sexual manner, but they are used in such a way that they, of themselves, in principle, exclude the possibility or the potentia, the potency, the potentiality, the intrinsic potentiality for a procreative end. And, that is also in common with, FAP and all kinds of, sexually degenerate behavior, and we'll get into more implications of that. So, since natural law determines whether specific acts are morally licit or illicit, based upon their ontic relation to human nature, I think an examination of human nature with respect to its sexual component is in order. Now, it is a matter of scientific fact, really, that sexual attraction and that kind of pleasure, in and of themselves, is derived principally from the reproductive system. Without the reproductive system, there would exist no sexual attraction or sexual pleasure. Therefore, it can be said that sexual pleasure and sexual attraction, and by extension, sexual activity, these are unintelligible of themselves apart from their relation to the reproductive organs from which springs such attractions and pleasures to begin with. Since that is the case, the rule and measure of human acts, natural law, must look to the sources in which those attractions and pleasures inhere, and discern their proper ends relative to those attractions and pleasures for which they exist. This discernment will be done, but first, to explain the moral significance of this discernment more fully, consider the following thought experiment. If they exist for their own sake, then it would be morally licit to seek those pleasures out for their own sake, independently of whatever ends coexist with them, so long as such a pursuit were also in conformity with other moral norms. If, however, these pleasures and attractions do not exist for their own sake, and if they are only conditionally existent in subordination to a more fundamental end which defines and delimits that type of pleasure or attraction being discussed, then seeking out those pleasures and attractions would only be morally licit insofar as they are sought after in accordance with what reason can discern as to the nature of what that fundamental end is and its circumstantial boundaries and the order of human acts. This is because if those pleasures and attractions are indeed existent within that ontological context, then separating those pleasures and attractions from that fundamental end, in principle, would render those pleasures and attractions entirely unintelligible, for they would be cut off from that which gives them meaning in the first place, and that which cannot be separated in principle can only be separated in practice under the pain of acting against reason, which is the ontic basis upon which moral evil is principally understood, according to natural law theory. For, again, reason is the rule and measure of human acts, so acting against reason is acting against what the rule and measure of human acts dictates as to what constitutes a morally good or morally evil one. Therefore, acting in a manner contrary to reason by formally participating precisely in the irrationality of that act whose nature is derived of itself from an error in the speculative reason, as, for example, removing sexual pleasure from the fundamental end for which it exists and has meaning by enjoying it without any relation to that fundamental end. This is simply to commit an evil act. So, now that the moral significance of what exactly is ontologically constitutive of the reproductive organs has been outlined in the form of this dilemma, such a discernment can take place. Again, referencing the settled science on the matter, the human reproductive system is entirely unintelligible both philosophically and scientifically apart from its relation to the product of human offspring and the biological means by which that offspring is brought into being, that is, sexual intercourse between one man and one woman. Since both reproductive organs are specifically designed in such a teleological structure that one cannot be fully understood without reference to the other, there is simply no way to understand the nature of masculinity without reference to femininity. These are real relations in the human substance that share utterly in the human substance, but at the same time, considered in and of themselves, are unintelligible without reference to each other. Furthermore, the production of offspring does not exist in a vacuum. Since the production of offspring is intrinsically connected to human sexuality, by extension, the very idea of an offspring and its definitional implications are also inextricably linked to human sexuality, which includes the bearing and rearing necessary for the offspring to one day live independently of its natural caretakers. So what does this mean in reference to the fundamental point discussed previously about natural law? It means that sexual pleasure and sexual attraction are unintelligible apart from the organs from which they are derived, defined, and delimited. And since those organs of themselves are unintelligible apart from their relation to one another, male and female respectively, as well as to the natural end of the production, bearing, and rearing of offspring, then it logically follows that sexual pleasure and sexual attraction is also unintelligible, both apart from their relation to a male and female union, as well as to the relation to the production of offspring and the bearing and rearing of that offspring. All of these things are intrinsically connected and cannot be separated in principle without rendering the entirety of the system unintelligible to the intellect. So, what does this mean in relation to natural law? Well, since to separate one of these things from the rest would render the entirety of the system unintelligible and hence contrary to reason, and since it is wholly through reason by which anything is intelligible at all, then to separate one of these things from the rest in practice would also be contrary to reason, and as such would be participatory in an ontological evil. This is because evil by nature is a privation of being, or a lack of what ought to be, and what ought to be is discerned, as has been shown, precisely through reason. Therefore, deductively, one can arrive at the conclusion that any rational agent who engages in a sexual act produced from the deliberation of the will of that rational agent, which excludes one of these three aspects of sexuality from the sexual act itself, participates in an ontological evil and acts immorally. Now, having said this, there are a plethora of objections one could raise against the argument presented. For example, one could say they could point to the conjugal relations of a couple that is infertile, for example. Would be an example of non-procreative sexual activity that is considered even by the Catholic Church to be morally fine. To this point, I think a concession has to be made of sorts. It is true that the activity between an infertile heterosexual couple is non-procreative. However, a crucial distinction has to be made here. Scholastic philosophy distinguishes between that which is per se and that which is per accidens. Per se refers to that which is the way it is in principle, that is, of or relating to the definition or nature of a thing. Per accidens, this refers to that which is posterior to the definition or nature of the thing, but is nevertheless existent, albeit merely as a quality or as a non-essential characteristic. Take, for example, a square. A square, by definition per se, has four sides. That is essential to its immutable definition and nature. However, squares differ in their manifestations. One square may have an X drawn through it, for example, but that does not affect its nature as a square, since it retains its being a shape with four sides. The X drawn through the square is merely an attribute, per accidens, of this particular square, but it does not alter the essence of what the square is in principle, per se. Similarly, the non-procreative relations between two members of the same sex and between a man and a woman who together constitute an infertile couple differ along these same categories. Homosexual relations, just to use an example, are not merely incidentally non-procreative, they are essentially non-procreative, as they are merely mutually masturbatory. Such sexual acts, by their nature, have of themselves absolutely zero relation whatsoever to the procreative power inherent in the nature of sexuality itself, except by virtue of the fact that they are precisely deviations from the true nature of sexuality, as defined and argued for previously. Conversely, infertile couples, when they have relations, are not engaging in an act that is, in principle, non-procreative, for the object of their action is sexual intercourse between a man and a woman. That act in principle is always procreative, because the nature of sexual intercourse between a man and a woman, taken in the abstract, independent of particular circumstance, by nature tends toward the production and ultimately the bearing and rearing of children. What prevents this from taking place is not the object of the act itself, but some condition extrinsic to the matter of the act itself. which, per accidens, renders the finality of the act unable to be realized. Homosexual relations simply inhabit an entirely different category altogether, so the objection holds no water. Secondly, one may object that there is really no grounds to insist that every act must keep intact both the subordinate end and the primary end. In other words, why is it necessary that the unitive aspect of sexuality must always and everywhere be united to the procreative end in every instantiation of a properly sexual act, that is, acts that are derivative from the organs of generation? Now, to this, it should be said that the distinction between unitive and procreative is not a distinction that can be thoroughly abstracted from one another and made intelligible in and of themselves. They're inextricably linked together. One cannot be understood without reference to the other. The unitive aspect of sex of itself is ordered toward the procreative, since the unitive is made intelligible through the mode of the sexual organs, which of themselves, principally, is ordered toward the procreation, bearing, and rearing of children. Furthermore, pleasure does not exist in a vacuum. Pleasure of itself is common to many appetites of human nature. It is defined as this type of pleasure or that type of pleasure through the type of faculty it adheres in, which delimits it as sexual pleasure, for example. So therefore, the pleasure and unitive connectivity between the two engaging in these activities are understood in and through the faculty from which they are derived, i.e. the reproductive faculty, which is itself the ontological basis of the second precept of the natural law. Similarly, it is impossible to fully abstract the procreative end from the unitive end as it relates to human beings. Human beings are not animals with the ability to reason superadded to it. They are of themselves rational animals. This distinction between rationality and animality is one that is logical, not real in the sense that one can distinguish one from the other in extramental reality, when they are united together in one substance. Since the unitive aspect of human sexuality flows from reason, since it is through reason that the virtue of friendship is made possible, the procreative faculty has to be understood through the mode of rational beings, which demand a certain friendship necessary to stay together for life and actually bear and rear the child that may indeed be brought about as a result of conjugal relations. Hence, it is also impossible to fully abstract the procreative aspect of human sexuality apart from the unitive without facing profound absurdity. It is metaphysically impossible and reductive to absurdity to separate these two aspects of human sexuality in principle, for in separation from one another each amount to something entirely unintelligible, and hence irrational, which is precisely what happens in every instance of homosexual acts, sodomitical acts, contraceptive acts, and masturbatory acts, since of themselves they are unable to tend toward both of these aspects properly understood. Therefore, these activities, since they can in no way be ordered toward the procreation and education of children as generative of these activities, and indeed they cannot even be said to be authentically unitive, because, as I said, the unitive is inextricably linked to the procreative, which informs the way in which the unitive is understood. Since these activities cannot fulfill any of this, then they cannot be reconciled with what the moral law demands of human beings as regard the second precept of the natural law. That being said, moral fault is only present in he who, through the deliberation of the will, chooses to participate in an ontological evil, such as this. Those who experience deep-seated tendencies that are ordered toward ontological evils and yet in no way choose to participate in those ontological evils by way of their will cannot be said to be guilty of a sin or an evil deed such as this, or indeed of any sin. Nevertheless, given what has been said, it must be maintained that these activities, these deviations from the moral law, in the order of deliberated human acts, since they are in every case generative of an ontological evil, as has been shown, cannot, under any circumstances, be justified as morally licit. Therefore, it cannot be rationally avoided on pain of absurdity. That fact truly is degeneracy.